The grand chamber stretched before them like a cathedral built for giants. Ambassador Daniel Wright walked slowly across the polished floor, his footsteps echoing in the massive space. Behind him came Commander Lisa Hayes and Dr. Peter Morgan, both carrying data tablets filled with months of negotiations and carefully prepared arguments. The ceiling above them glowed with bioluminescent panels that shifted colors according to the mood of the council members, and right now those panels pulsed with impatient reds and oranges. 6 months had passed since Earth sent its delegation to this neutral space station. 6 months of talking, explaining, and trying to convince 5 ancient species that humanity deserved a seat at the table. Daniel had spent countless hours in smaller meetings, learning the customs and protocols of species that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. He had studied their languages, respected their traditions, and presented humanity's case with patience and diplomacy. But today felt different. Today the air itself seemed heavy with finality. The council sat on elevated platforms arranged in a semicircle. Each platform held representatives from one of the 5 founding species. The Virex looked like enormous mantises, their chitinous bodies gleaming under the chamber lights. The Nelthar existed as clouds of sentient gas contained within transparent spherical chambers. The Korthan resembled living crystal formations that hummed with internal energy. The Saskari were reptilian beings with scales that changed color based on their emotions. The Thalos floated in water-filled tanks, their tentacles moving in patterns that Daniel had learned to read as speech. High Chancellor Vrex Tal rose from his platform. His mandibles clicked together in a rhythm that the translation device rendered as polite greeting. Daniel had learned to distrust that politeness over the past months. The Chancellor's compound eyes reflected the light in ways that made reading his true intentions nearly impossible. The human delegation took their seats at the central podium. Daniel placed his tablet on the smooth surface and waited. Lisa sat to his right, her military uniform crisp and proper despite the month spent in diplomatic settings. Peter adjusted his glasses and opened his notebook, a habit from his years in research that no amount of advanced technology could break. High Chancellor Vrex Tal began to speak. The translator converted his clicking and chittering into smooth, measured words. He spoke of the great honor being bestowed upon humanity. He detailed the long history of the Galactic Council and its success in maintaining peace across thousands of worlds. He explained how joining the Council meant entering a family of civilizations that had mastered the arts of governance and cooperation. Daniel listened without interruption. He had heard these speeches before, but something in the Chancellor's tone suggested this time would be different. The other council members remained silent, their attention focused entirely on the human delegation. Then came the terms. High Chancellor Vrex Tal described what he called a generous offer, designed specifically for humanity's unique situation as a newcomer to galactic society. Humans could join the Council as a protectorate species. This meant Earth and its colonies would receive protection from potential threats and access to some Council technologies. In exchange, humanity would accept certain reasonable restrictions. The restrictions came in a steady stream. Human voting rights would be limited for the next 200 years. Earth would pay annual tribute to the Council treasury. Human military forces would be reduced by 70%. All human colony worlds beyond the solar system would accept Council-appointed governors. Human ships could not enter certain regions of space without explicit permission. Human scientists would need Council approval before researching specific technologies. Human trade agreements with non-Council species required Council oversight. The list continued for nearly an hour. With each new restriction, Daniel felt something hardening inside his chest. Lisa's jaw tightened beside him. Peter stopped taking notes and simply stared at the Chancellor with an expression of disbelief. When High Chancellor Vrex Tal finally finished, he spread his forelegs in a gesture that among the Vrex indicated generosity and benevolence. He smiled, or at least performed the equivalent action with his mandibles. The translation device rendered his next words with warm satisfaction. These terms represented the standard path for all new species entering the Council. Every member had accepted similar conditions and had eventually grown into full participation. Humanity should feel grateful for this opportunity. The Chancellor indicated that he expected immediate acceptance, so the formal ceremonies could begin. The chamber fell silent. The bioluminescent panels above shifted to expectant blues and greens. Council members leaned forward on their platforms, In their minds, this moment was a formality. Species always accepted council membership. The alternative was to remain isolated, vulnerable, and primitive. Daniel stood slowly. He gathered his tablet and the papers Peter had prepared. He looked at each council member in turn, meeting their eyes or optical sensors or whatever organs they used for sight. Then he looked directly at High Chancellor Vrextal. His voice was calm and clear when he spoke. The United Earth government respectfully declines your offer. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. The words seemed to hang in the air, not quite real. The translation devices in each council platform flickered as if doubting their own accuracy. Then chaos erupted. High Chancellor Vrextal's mandibles clacked together in rapid patterns that the translator struggled to keep up with. The Nelthar's gaseous form swirled violently inside their containment sphere. The Korthan's crystalline structure pulsed with harsh red light. The Saskari representative's scales flashed through angry yellows and oranges. Only the Thelos remained relatively calm, their tentacles moving in slow, thoughtful patterns. Daniel continued speaking over the noise. He explained that humanity appreciated the Council's time and consideration. However, the terms offered were not acceptable to a free and sovereign species. Humanity would not trade independence for protection. Earth and its colonies would forge their own path among the stars. The United Earth government wished the Council well and hoped that future interactions might occur under more equitable circumstances. He finished his statement and closed his tablet. Lisa and Peter stood with him. Together they turned and walked toward the chamber exit. Behind them, the Council erupted into full argument. Multiple species tried to speak at once. High Chancellor Vrextal was demanding they return immediately. The Nelthar representative was trying to call for order. The Saskari general was shouting something about consequences and military protocols. The massive doors slid open before them. Daniel walked through without looking back. Lisa followed, her hand resting instinctively near where her sidearm would be if diplomatic protocols allowed such things. Peter glanced over his shoulder once, his scientific curiosity wanting to observe the Council's reaction, but he kept walking. The corridor outside was empty and quiet after the chaos of the chamber. Their footsteps echoed differently here, no longer swallowed by the vast space but bouncing sharply off metal walls. Daniel took a deep breath and felt something release in his chest. The weight of 6 months of fruitless negotiation lifted slightly. They reached the docking bay where the UES Constellation waited. The ship was small by Council standards, sleek and functional in the way human engineering favored. The crew had been waiting on standby, ready for either outcome. Captain Ryan Cole met them at the airlock, his expression carefully neutral. Daniel gave a single nod. "We are leaving." Within minutes, the Constellation detached from the station. As they pulled away, Daniel stood on the bridge and composed his message to Earth. He kept it brief and factual. Negotiations had failed. The Council's terms were unacceptable. Humanity would proceed independently. He attached his full report and sent it on the fastest available channel. Lisa joined him at the viewport. Behind them, the Council station grew smaller, its lights fading into the background of stars. She spoke quietly, asking if he thought they had made the right choice. Daniel watched the stars ahead of them. Somewhere out there, Earth waited for their return. Beyond Earth lay 17 human colonies, each one filled with people who had left everything familiar to build new lives among alien suns. Those people deserve better than subjugation dressed up as membership. He answered her question with certainty. Walking away was the only choice worth making. 3 days passed before the Galactic Council could gather itself enough to hold another formal session. High Chancellor Vrextal had spent those days in his private chambers, refusing to speak with anyone. The other council members whispered among themselves, uncertain how to proceed. Never in the 5,000 years of council history had a species simply walked away from membership. Some species had been denied entry, some had been conquered and absorbed, but none had ever rejected the council's offer. The emergency session began with the bioluminescent panels set to angry reds. High Chancellor Vrextal stood on his platform, his chitinous body rigid with barely controlled fury. He spoke of insults and disrespect. He described the human rejection as an attack on council authority itself. His mandibles clicked so rapidly that the translation system struggled to keep pace. He demanded immediate action, though he did not specify what form that action should take. Chief Strategist Corthan 9 waited for the Chancellor's rage to exhaust itself before requesting permission to speak. The crystalline being's internal light pulsed in steady, calming patterns. When granted the floor, Corthan 9 presented an analysis that made the entire chamber fall silent. The humans controlled 17 star systems. Their colonies spread across multiple sectors, each one growing faster than Council projections had predicted. The total human population had reached 22 billion, with growth rates that outpaced most established Council species. Their industrial capacity was primitive by Council standards, but expanding at what Corthan 9 called an alarming rate. They built factories on asteroids, mining operations on lifeless moons, and orbital stations around every world they touched. But the real concern was military capability. Corthan 9 displayed data gathered by Council observers over the past 50 years, since humans had achieved faster-than-light travel. While most Council species had evolved past large-scale warfare, humans had refined it into something approaching an art form. Their ships carried weapons designed with disturbing efficiency. Their soldiers trained constantly for combat scenarios that most Council species could not even imagine. Every human colony maintained defense forces, every human ship carried armaments, and every human station had shields and point defense systems. The Vrex general interrupted to point out that human technology was centuries behind Council capabilities. Their ships were slower, their weapons less powerful, their shields weaker. Surely the Council military could handle any threat from such primitives. Corthan 9's crystals flashed in a pattern that indicated disagreement. The analysis continued. Human ships might be primitive, but they existed in vast numbers. Human weapons might be less powerful, but they were reliable and easy to manufacture. Human shields might be weaker, but their ships were built with redundant systems that made them difficult to disable completely. More importantly, humans had something most Council species lacked after millennia of peace. They had recent experience with actual warfare. Ambassador Thelos Pearl moved her tentacles in patterns that requested attention. The aquatic being had been observing quietly until now, her tank glowing with thoughtful purples and blues. When recognized, she presented information that sent waves of concern through the chamber. Human diplomats had been making contact with unaligned species. These were the dozens of civilizations that existed outside Council authority, either because they had refused membership or because the Council had never invited them. Some were too small to matter, others too remote, and a few were too troublesome to integrate. But together, they represented a significant portion of the galaxy's populated worlds. The humans had approached 16 of these species in just the past 3 months. They offered trade agreements with no strings attached. They proposed technology exchanges on equal terms. They suggested mutual defense pacts that treated all signatories as sovereign equals. Several species had responded positively to these overtures. The Talveri, a feline species that had long resisted Council pressure, had already signed a preliminary trade agreement with Earth. High Chancellor Vrex Tal began clicking his mandibles in agitation. This was exactly what he had feared. The humans were not simply going their own way. They were actively building an alternative to the Council itself. General Kresh of the Saskari stood next. His scales had turned a dark green that indicated serious concern. As head of Council military intelligence, he had access to information that made him deeply uncomfortable. Human colonies had begun fortification efforts immediately after their delegation departed. Orbital defense platforms were under construction around every major human world. Military outposts appeared on the edges of human-controlled space. New weapons testing had been detected in remote systems. But what truly worried General Kresh were reports from Council intelligence operatives. Human scientists were working on technologies that should have been beyond their current capabilities. Quantum torpedo prototypes had been observed in testing ranges. Dimensional shield research was progressing far faster than it should. Somehow, humans were leaping ahead in their development, skipping the normal incremental progress that most species followed. A junior Corthan representative asked the obvious question. How were humans advancing so quickly without Council guidance? Where were they getting the theoretical frameworks for technologies that took Council species centuries to develop? General Kresh admitted he did not know. Human research methods were chaotic compared to Council standards. They seemed to approach problems from multiple angles simultaneously, trying things that should not work according to established physics. Sometimes those attempts failed spectacularly, but sometimes they succeeded in ways that baffled council scientists. The Nelthar representative, a being called Nelthar Wind, swirled thoughtfully in their containment sphere. They suggested the possibility that humans might simply think differently than council species. Perhaps their recent arrival at spacefaring status meant they had not yet learned what was supposedly impossible. They tried things that more advanced species would dismiss as impractical, and occasionally those attempts produced unexpected breakthroughs. High Chancellor Vrextal rejected this theory with an angry click. Humans were not special. They were simply reckless and ignorant. The question was what to do about them. Various council members offered suggestions. Some proposed economic sanctions, cutting off human access to council trade networks. Corthan 9 pointed out that humans traded primarily with each other and with unaligned species. Sanctions would have minimal impact and would likely push humans closer to potential allies outside council influence. Others suggested diplomatic isolation, refusing to acknowledge human governments or respond to their communications. Ambassador Thalos Pearl noted that this would only reinforce human independence and might encourage other species to question whether council membership was truly necessary. The more aggressive members, particularly the Saskari military faction, proposed a limited military strike. Destroy a few human outposts to demonstrate council superiority and bring humanity back to negotiations with a more respectful attitude. General Kresh himself argued against this option. He presented casualty estimates that shocked the chamber. Human defensive capabilities were stronger than they appeared. A military strike would succeed eventually, but the costs would be substantial. Human forces would fight with determination that peaceful council species could barely comprehend. Worse, such an attack would validate human fears about council intentions and would likely drive the unaligned species directly into human arms. The debate continued for hours. Each proposed solution had fatal flaws. Sanctions would not work. Isolation would backfire. Military action was too costly and would create the very alliance bloc they feared. Yet doing nothing meant watching human influence grow, while council authority weakened. A young Thalos representative named Thalos Stream spoke up from the junior delegation area. Her tentacles moved in tentative patterns as she suggested something radical. Perhaps the council should consider why humans rejected their offer. Perhaps the terms themselves were the problem. If humans found those terms unacceptable, how many other species quietly resented similar conditions imposed on them? High Chancellor Vrextal silenced her immediately. The council's methods had maintained peace and prosperity for 5,000 years. The system worked. The problem was human arrogance, not council policy, but Thalos Stream's words hung in the air anyway. Several junior members from various species exchanged glances. They had all entered the council under similar protectorate terms. They all still had limited voting rights decades or even centuries after joining. They all paid tribute and accepted council oversight in their internal affairs. They had accepted these conditions because the alternative was isolation and potential conquest. But what if there was another alternative? What if the humans were showing them a different path? Corthan 9 presented the final piece of analysis. The situation would continue to deteriorate unless the council acted decisively. Human influence was growing daily. More unaligned species were considering human proposals. President Karen Foster stood before the United Earth Assembly in Geneva, her hands resting on the podium as she looked out at the representatives from every nation and colony. The chamber was packed with delegates who had been waiting for 3 days since the constellation returned from council space. News of the failed negotiations had already spread through every human world, and people wanted answers. Karen began by explaining what had happened in that distant station. She described the council's offer in detail, reading directly from the official document they had presented. As she listed each restriction and requirement, angry murmurs grew louder in the chamber. When she reached the part about mandatory tribute and council governors on human colonies, several delegates stood and shouted their opposition. She let them vent for a moment before raising her hand for silence. Then she explained what Ambassador Daniel Wright had done. He had rejected the offer completely. He had walked away from the negotiating table. He had chosen independence over subjugation. The chamber erupted in applause that lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Delegates embraced each other. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others pumped their fists in the air. This was what they had hoped for but had been afraid to expect. Humanity would stand on its own. Karen waited for the celebration to die down before continuing. Walking away was only the first step. Now came the hard part. Earth and its colonies needed to prepare for whatever came next. The Council might accept their decision peacefully, but they might also respond with economic pressure or even military action. Humanity could not afford to be caught unprepared. She announced the Independence Protocol, a comprehensive plan that would transform human civilization over the next 5 years. The protocol had 3 main components covering military strength, technological advancement, and diplomatic outreach. Each component would receive unlimited funding and resources until humanity could stand as equals to any galactic power. Admiral Jack Morrison received command of the military expansion program. His task was simple but enormous: double the size of the human fleet within 5 years. Every shipyard from Earth to the outer colonies would run at maximum capacity. New yards would be constructed on every major world. Military academies would triple their enrollment. Defense platforms would ring every human system. Dr. Helen Carter, Director of Advanced Research, was given control of the technology initiative. For decades, human scientists had followed safe incremental progress similar to Council methods. That caution was now abandoned. Helen had permission to pursue any research that showed promise, no matter how experimental or dangerous. Quantum physics, dimensional mechanics, exotic materials, biological enhancements, artificial intelligence, everything was now open for exploration. The only rule was that Council restrictions no longer applied. Diplomat Linda Shaw took charge of the diplomatic outreach program. Her mission was to contact every unaligned species in known space. She would offer them what the Council never had: genuine friendship between equals. Trade agreements would be fair and reciprocal. Technology sharing would benefit all parties. Defense pacts would protect sovereignty rather than undermine it. Linda had 30 experienced diplomats under her command and authorization to promise whatever was necessary to build alliances. The Assembly voted unanimously to approve the Independence Protocol. Within hours, the entire human civilization began to mobilize. It was not preparation for war, though military readiness was part of it. It was preparation for true independence, for the ability to chart humanity's own course among the stars without asking permission from ancient powers. On the colony world of New Virginia, Governor Stephen Pierce watched the president's speech with satisfaction. His world had been established only 30 years ago by settlers who wanted to build something new, far from Earth's crowded cities. Now those settlers would build something else: the largest shipyard complex in human space. Stephen had already cleared the location and recruited workers. Within weeks, the first construction crews arrived with prefabricated components shipped from Earth. The New Virginia yards would focus on military vessels, but not the small patrol ships that humanity currently relied on. Stephen's engineers had designs for something bigger: heavy cruisers that could stand against Council warships, carriers that could deploy fighter squadrons, even a prototype dreadnought that existed only on paper, but would become real if the project received approval. The colony that had been a peaceful farming world was transforming into an industrial powerhouse. On New Beijing, General Rebecca Nguyen drilled her colonial defense forces with new intensity. Rebecca had military experience from Earth's last major conflict 20 years ago, and she understood something that many peaceful colonists did not. If the Council decided to use force, they would expect a conventional battle where their superior technology would dominate. They would not expect guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, and unconventional strategies that turned their advantages into vulnerabilities. Rebecca trained her forces to fight in ways that would shock Council military doctrine: ambush tactics, hit-and-run strikes, using terrain and obstacles to negate technological superiority. She taught them to target supply lines rather than engage in direct combat. She showed them how to make every building, every tunnel, every crater into a defensive position. If Council forces came to New Beijing, they would find it easy to land but impossible to hold. Meanwhile, the Constellation had docked at Luna Station above Earth's moon. Daniel Wright, Lisa Hayes, and Peter Morgan were debriefing with intelligence analysts, going over every detail of their time at Council space. The analysts wanted to know everything about Council capabilities, military dispositions, political factions, and potential weaknesses. Daniel described the Council's obvious complacency. They had been the dominant power for so long that they could not imagine a serious challenge. Their ships were advanced but few in number. Their soldiers were well-equipped but inexperienced. Their politicians were skilled at maintaining the status quo but struggled with unexpected situations. Peter shared his analysis of Council species biology and psychology. This was perhaps the most valuable intelligence of all. The Council species had evolved past warfare in their distant past. They maintained military forces out of tradition and necessity, but their instincts for combat had dulled over millennia of peace. They could fight, but they had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. Humans were different. Earth had been a harsh crucible that forged humanity through countless conflicts and near extinctions. Competition, struggle, and adaptation were burned into human nature at a genetic level. Council species saw warfare as an aberration. Humans understood it as simply another challenge to overcome. Lisa added tactical observations. Council military doctrine was rigid and predictable. They followed established patterns that had not changed in centuries. They relied heavily on their technological advantages and seemed unable to adapt when those advantages were neutralized. A creative human commander could exploit those weaknesses with proper planning. The intelligence reports from human operatives scattered across Council space painted an interesting picture. The Council was fracturing. Junior member species were questioning the authority of the Founding Five. Some had sent covert messages to Daniel expressing interest in human proposals for a more democratic structure. A few had even hinted that they might be willing to leave the Council if a viable alternative existed. This was the opening humanity needed. Linda Shaw and her diplomatic team immediately began quiet negotiations with these disaffected species. They offered nothing except respect and the promise of equal treatment. For species that had spent decades or centuries as second-class Council members, that promise was remarkably appealing. Dr. Helen Carter's research initiatives began producing results faster than anyone expected. Human scientists approach problems differently than their Council counterparts. Where Council researchers followed established theories and proven methods, human scientists tried everything. They combined disciplines in unconventional ways. They tested ideas that seemed impossible. They failed often, but learned from each failure. One team achieved a breakthrough in shield technology by accidentally crossing gravitational manipulation with quantum field theory. The resulting shield was weaker than Council versions, but required a fraction of the power and could be installed on much smaller ships. Another team developed a new type of missile that used dimensional folding to bypass conventional shields entirely. The weapon was unreliable and sometimes failed catastrophically, but when it worked, it was devastatingly effective. Admiral Morrison's fleet expansion program faced challenges but moved forward relentlessly. Shipyards worked around the clock. Raw materials flowed in from mining operations across 17 systems. Recruits flooded military academies, eager to defend humanity's newfound independence. The first new cruisers were already under construction, their hulls taking shape in orbital docks. But Morrison understood that numbers alone would not be enough. Human ships needed to be different from Council vessels. Armstrong's station on Earth's moon had been expanded 3 times in the past 6 months to accommodate the expected guests. Daniel Wright stood in the main conference hall watching workers put finishing touches on the seating arrangements. The hall could hold 500 beings comfortably, with environmental controls adjusted for dozens of different atmospheric requirements. Transparent dividers separated sections for species that required different pressures or gas mixtures. Translation equipment lined the walls, ready to convert dozens of languages simultaneously. 31 species had confirmed attendance at what Daniel was calling the first Free Species Convention. These were the unaligned worlds, the civilizations that had refused Council membership or had never been invited. Some were small populations on remote worlds. Others were established civilizations that simply preferred independence. A few had been actively pressured by the Council for years but had resisted. Linda Shaw approached with her data tablet showing the arrival schedule. The first delegation would dock within the hour. She had been coordinating with each species for weeks, learning their customs and requirements. Some needed methane atmospheres, others required high-gravity environments. One species communicated through bioluminescent patterns and needed special viewing chambers. Linda had arranged for everything. The first to arrive were the Talvari, a feline species that walked upright and wore minimal clothing suited to their thick fur. Their leader was named Kendra Tal, and she greeted Daniel with a gesture that resembled a bow. The Talvari had been resisting council pressure for decades, and they were eager to hear what humanity proposed. Over the next 12 hours, delegations arrived in a steady stream. The Ulani came in crystalline bodies that resembled smaller, friendlier versions of the council's Korthan. The Breviks were insectoid but nothing like the aggressive Vrex. The Milan were aquatic beings that floated in mobile water tanks. The Torsion were energy beings that existed as controlled plasma within containment fields. Each species brought their own unique biology and culture, but they all shared one thing in common. They valued their independence. When all 31 delegations had settled into their assigned areas, Daniel opened the convention with a simple welcome. He thanked everyone for making the journey to human space. He explained that humanity had recently faced a choice between joining the Galactic Council under unfavorable terms or maintaining independence. They had chosen independence, and now they wanted to know if other species might be interested in a different approach to galactic cooperation. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Kendra Tal of the Talvari spoke first. Her species had been threatened with sanctions and isolation for refusing council membership. They had survived through determination and careful trading with other unaligned worlds. If humanity was proposing an alternative to the council, the Talvari wanted to hear it. Daniel presented the basic framework that he and Linda had developed over the past months. Create an alliance of free worlds based on mutual respect. All members would have equal standing, regardless of size or technological level. Trade would be open and fair with no mandatory tribute. Technology would be shared freely among members. Defense would be collective, with all members contributing to mutual protection. Most importantly, no member would have authority over another. Decisions would be made democratically with each species having a voice. The convention hall erupted in discussion. Species that had never spoken to each other before began comparing notes on their experiences with the council. Stories emerged of pressure tactics, economic manipulation, and threats. Several species described how the council had tried to force their membership by creating artificial crises or supporting internal opposition groups. Others spoke of watching their neighbors become council protectorates and slowly losing their independence and identity. A delegate from the Ulani species, a scientist named Vera Prime, asked the crucial question: what could this alliance offer that individual independence did not? Why should species give up complete autonomy to join another organization, even a democratic one? Daniel had expected this question and had prepared his answer carefully. Individual independence was valuable, but it left small species vulnerable to larger powers. The council used that vulnerability to pressure species into unfavorable memberships. An alliance of free worlds would provide collective strength while preserving individual sovereignty. Members could call on each other for support but were not obligated to follow orders from a central authority. It was cooperation, not subjugation. Linda added practical examples. The Talvari had advanced sensor technology that other species lacked. The Ulani had expertise in crystalline computing that could benefit everyone. Humans had manufacturing capacity and military experience. By sharing these strengths, all members would benefit without anyone losing control of their own resources or decisions. The discussions continued for 3 days. Representatives broke into smaller groups to debate specific proposals. Some species were cautious, worried about trading one master for another. Others were eager to sign immediately. Daniel and Linda moved between groups, answering questions and addressing concerns. On the third day, Kendra Tal proposed a formal structure. The alliance would be called the Coalition of Free Worlds. Each member species would send representatives to a central assembly. Decisions would require a simple majority vote, with each species having one vote regardless of size. Member species would maintain complete internal sovereignty. The coalition would handle only external matters like defense, trade agreements with non-members, and technology sharing programs. The proposal was refined through another full day of discussion. Additional provisions were added to protect minority rights and ensure that larger species could not dominate smaller ones. A charter was drafted that clearly spelled out the limitations of coalition authority and the rights of individual members. When the final vote came, 19 species agreed to become founding members of the Coalition of Free Worlds. The others requested observer status, wanting to see how the organization developed before making a commitment. Daniel accepted this readily. The coalition needed to prove itself through actions, not just words. The signing ceremony took place in the main hall with representatives from all 31 species present. Each founding member placed their mark on the charter, using whatever method their biology allowed. Some signed with appendages, others used energy patterns, and a few simply transmitted their acceptance through electronic means. When the last signature was recorded, the hall erupted in celebration. But even as the ceremony concluded, news was arriving from Council Space that changed everything. Linda received an urgent message from one of their intelligence operatives. 3 junior council member species had formally requested observer status at coalition meetings. The species were small and had limited influence within the council structure, but their action was unprecedented. Council members simply did not engage with unaligned species except through official council channels. Daniel realized immediately what this meant. The coalition was no longer just an alliance of minor powers. It was becoming a legitimate alternative to the council itself. Those 3 species were testing the waters, seeing if the coalition offered a better future than their current second-class status within the council structure. Hi. Chancellor Vrextal sent an immediate message demanding that the 3 species withdraw their request. He threatened sanctions and expulsion from the council. But the 3 species ignored the threats and sent their observers to the next coalition meeting anyway. This act of defiance sent shockwaves through council space. Within weeks, 12 more species petitioned for coalition membership. Some were unaligned worlds that had been sitting on the fence. Others were council protectorates that declared independence specifically to join the coalition. The movement was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. General Kresh of the Saskari presented new intelligence to the council that caused genuine panic. The coalition now controlled 48 star systems. Their combined industrial output was approaching council levels. More importantly, human military advisors were training coalition defense forces. Human engineers were upgrading coalition ships with new weapons and shield systems. The ragtag collection of minor powers was rapidly becoming a legitimate military force. Dr. Peter Morgan had been working with coalition scientists on technology sharing programs. He discovered something remarkable in the process. Many of these species had unique technologies or approaches that even the council lacked. The Talveri sensors could detect quantum fluctuations that council systems missed. The Ulani computing crystals processed information in ways that conventional systems could not match. The Breivik had developed biological ship components that could self-repair. When these technologies were shared freely within the coalition, the result was a burst of innovation that surprised everyone. Human manufacturing combined with Talveri sensors and Ulani computing created defense systems that exceeded anything humanity could have built alone. Brevik's biological components integrated with human weapons produced entirely new types of armaments. 1 year had passed since Daniel Wright walked away from the Galactic Council's offer. In that time, the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Coalition of Free Worlds now included 63 member species controlling over 100 star systems. Trade routes connected coalition worlds in an intricate network that bypassed Council space entirely. The combined coalition fleet numbered in the thousands of ships, still smaller than the Council's armada, but large enough to make any military confrontation unthinkably costly for both sides. But numbers alone did not tell the full story. The coalition had become something that the Council had never been, a genuine community of equals. Species shared technology freely, collaborated on research projects, and supported each other through challenges. The Talveri sensors that had once been a closely guarded secret were now standard equipment on coalition ships. Human manufacturing techniques had spread to dozens of worlds, boosting their industrial capacity. Ulani computing crystals processed data for the entire coalition network. Every member contributed what they could and received what they needed. The Council watched this development with growing alarm. 8 of their own member species had formally complained about the Founding Five's authoritarian control. 2 had threatened to leave entirely. The junior members saw what the coalition offered and wondered why they had ever accepted their second-class status within the Council. Dozens of unaligned species that the Council had courted for years were now joining the coalition instead. High Chancellor Vrex Tal had tried everything to stop the bleeding. Economic sanctions had failed because coalition trade networks were self-sufficient. Diplomatic pressure had backfired, driving more species toward the coalition. Military threats remained empty because General Kresh had made it clear that war would cost more than the Council could afford. The Chancellor's authority was crumbling, and he knew it. The final blow came when a vote of no confidence was called within the Council itself. Junior members who had tolerated Vrex Tal's leadership during peaceful times now saw him as the architect of a crisis that threatened their security and prosperity. The vote was close, but it passed. For the first time in Council history, a High Chancellor was removed from power by democratic process rather than death or retirement. The new High Chancellor was Corthan Seven, a moderate crystalline being who had privately advocated for reform even before the human crisis began. Corthan Seven's internal light pulsed with calm determination as he took the position. His first act was to send a message to Secretary Daniel Wright, now humanity's chief diplomat for interstellar affairs. The Council wished to open negotiations with the Coalition of Free Worlds. Daniel brought the request before the Coalition Assembly, which now met regularly in a rotating schedule across member worlds. The Assembly chamber on the neutral station Haven 1 was filled with representatives from 63 species, each with their own thoughts about engaging with the Council. Some wanted nothing to do with the organization that had pressured them for years. Others saw an opportunity to reshape galactic politics entirely. The debate lasted for 3 full days. Kendra Tal of the Talveri argued passionately against any negotiations, reminding everyone of the Council's past threats and manipulations. Vera Prime of the Ulani took a more pragmatic approach, suggesting that negotiation from a position of strength was different than negotiating from weakness. Representatives from former Council protectorates shared their experiences of life under Council authority and urged caution. Daniel listened to all perspectives before offering his own view. The Coalition had been formed to provide an alternative to Council dominance, not to destroy the Council itself. If the Council was willing to negotiate as equals, then the Coalition should at least hear what they had to say. But negotiations must happen on neutral ground with both sides having equal standing. No more platforms and elevated seats. No more assumptions of superiority. The Assembly voted narrowly to accept the Council's request with conditions. Negotiations would be held on New Harmony, a human colony world specifically chosen for its symbolic name. Both sides would send equal-sized delegations. All decisions would be made by consensus between the two groups. If the Council could not accept these terms, then there would be no negotiations. Corthan Seven agreed to the conditions without hesitation. This alone signaled how much the situation had changed. The old Council would never have accepted such terms, but Corthan Seven understood that the galaxy had moved beyond the old ways, and the Council must adapt or become irrelevant. The negotiations began on a bright morning on New Harmony. The conference center was modest by galactic standards, built in a style that emphasized function over grandeur. No elevated platforms, no bioluminescent mood lighting, no architectural statements of dominance. Just tables, chairs, and translation equipment arranged in a circle where all participants could see each other as equals. The Council delegation arrived expecting some level of hostility. Instead, they were greeted with professional courtesy. Daniel and the other Coalition representatives treated them as fellow diplomats working toward a common goal. This simple act of respect was more disorienting to the Council members than any hostility would have been. The first week focused on establishing common ground. Both sides acknowledged that the galaxy was large enough for multiple approaches to governance. Neither group wanted war or ongoing conflict. Both recognized that cooperation on certain matters would benefit everyone. These basic agreements came easily once pride and posturing were set aside. The difficult part came when discussing specific structures. The Coalition wanted a complete restructuring of galactic governance. The Council wanted to maintain their authority while making minor reforms. The two positions seemed irreconcilable until Linda Shaw proposed a compromise that changed everything. What if there was a new organization entirely, one that included both Council and Coalition species? This Galactic Assembly would have equal representation for all members regardless of their previous affiliations. Old power structures would be dissolved. All species would have voting rights proportional to their population and territory. Technology sharing would be mandatory across all members. Military forces would be limited to defensive purposes only. Most importantly, no species could hold protectorate or tributary status over another. The Council delegation reacted with immediate resistance. Give up their privileged position? Accept that former protectorates were now equals? Share their advanced technologies with everyone? It seemed like they were being asked to surrender everything they had built over 5 millennia. But Corthan 7 surprised his own delegation by expressing support for the proposal. He explained that the Council's position was already lost. They could either accept a new structure where they had equal status with others, or they could watch their influence continue to decline until they became irrelevant. At least this way, Council species would have a voice in shaping the future rather than being left behind by it. The negotiations stretched across 3 months. Every detail was debated and refined. Compromises were made on all sides. The Council accepted democratic governance in exchange for the coalition, agreeing to honor existing Council treaties. Technology sharing would be gradual rather than immediate, to avoid destabilizing less advanced economies. Military limitations would be phased in over 10 years. Former Council protectorates would have their independence formally recognized with reparations paid for past exploitation. When the final agreement was ready, representatives from 97 species gathered for the signing ceremony. The location was Unity 1, a jointly constructed space station built specifically for this purpose. The station itself was a symbol of cooperation, designed and built by teams from both Council and Coalition worlds working together. High Chancellor Corthan 7 signed first, his crystalline appendage leaving an energy signature on the charter. Daniel Wright signed second, using a traditional pen on actual paper in the human custom. Then came representatives from every other species, each adding their mark in whatever way their biology allowed. The ceremony lasted for hours, but no one left. This was history being made. President Karen Foster addressed the inaugural session of the Galactic Assembly. She spoke to beings from nearly 100 different species, each with their own languages, cultures, and histories. Her words were translated into dozens of forms, but the message was universal. She reminded everyone of what had brought them to this moment. Humanity had been offered a choice between accepting subjugation or standing alone. They chose to stand alone, and that choice had resonated across the galaxy. Other species saw that independence was possible, that there were alternatives to the old power structures. The coalition had formed not through conquest or coercion, but through voluntary cooperation between equals. But Karen emphasized that this was not a human victory. It was a victory for every species that valued freedom and dignity. Daniel stood in the gallery,